couple of years ago, I did an end-to-end my entire brisket cook video. You can watch that here. And although my brisket process is changing all the time, I thought it would be good to show you kind of where I'm at the moment. The process and procedure that I'm using the most, particularly when it comes to just cooking one or two or just a small amount of briskets. So some of this stuff is going to be the same, some of it is going to be new, some of it is going to be the same stuff as before, but maybe paying a little bit more attention to it. And yeah, not going to leave anything out. I'm going to show you everything I do when it comes to cooking a brisket at home. So a point I'm going to make about the actual brisket that I'm using today, and that is I'm not necessarily using the brisket that I usually would when I'm cooking at home or cooking for an event, but basically the majority of people that watch this channel are either American or from North America, Canada, USA, and the UK. And I wanted to do a video that applied to both groups. So rather than getting a UK grass-fed brisket from here, one that I would use quite regularly here because the price point's good and they're pretty fatty, but it look and cook completely different to what you would be familiar with if you're from North America, I went with something that, in my opinion, is a good in-between. So this is a grain-fed Australian brisket. It's something that anyone in the UK can get their hands on. It's grain-fed, so it's a little bit more similar in appearance and fattiness to our cousins in the States with their grain-fed briskets. So hopefully this is a nice midway point. This shouldn't look too foreign to either group. And you've probably seen me and many other YouTube people trim many briskets. So I'm not gonna go into too much detail about this trim because there are dedicated trim videos out there that will be way better than trying to fit that into this entire brisket cook video. But we're going to trim this like I would pretty much any brisket. Make sure it's nice and round, take off anything that's too lean. Don't want anything too sharp or hanging off, just rounding it out. So from a trim shape perspective, I'm sure that's looking pretty familiar to everyone. As I say, I've got videos on trimming specifically. I've trimmed many briskets in other videos, so go check out that or go check out Joe Yim's how to trim a brisket video. Way better than anything I could do. So this is trimmed up, ready to go. And when it comes to seasoning, rather than just chucking on some salt and pepper, there are a couple of steps to the process that I like to take that I feel give me a better brisket, or more specifically, a better quality bark. And that is to firstly, trim and season the day before. So today is the day before we're going to cook this brisket. So we'll get it seasoned up now and I'll explain why I do it the day before in a minute. And I like to use the hotel pan method, the dump method, rather than the shaker method because you get a perfect application of salt and pepper every single time, and it's the same every single time. It's really consistent and it's much quicker, easier and cleaner in my opinion. And I'm sure some of you who've seen the guys at Leroy and Lewis doing this. In terms of pepper, I like to use the Kirkland from Costco coarse black pepper. Of course, alternatively, you can pick up the Chud Rub from my buddy Brad. And we're gonna go in with 2 parts of that coarse black pepper, 2, and 1 part Diamond Crystal Kosher salt. And there's another seasoning step that we're gonna take tomorrow morning, which we'll do just before we get this on the pit. We're gonna go in with our brisket, presentation side down, make sure that that gets a really nice coverage. And this looks like a lot of seasoning because it is a lot of seasoning, but it won't be too salty, it won't be too peppery. It pretty much works out perfectly seasoned every single time, which is why I like this method. If you use the shaker method, you know, you have a higher propensity to put less or more salt on every time. It's not consistent. So that is one of the reasons I like this method. And as I say, this is not going to be too salty, even though we're going to season this again tomorrow with some seasoning salt, because there are a couple of steps that we're going to take at the end of this brisket process, which means some of this saltiness is going to get even more blanded out. So that's all seasoned up. Get this brisket, if it will fit, onto a wire rack, and you've got yourself a pretty perfectly seasoned brisket. And the reason why I like to do it this way is because in my experience, I get the best bark on my briskets if I season the night before. We're gonna put this into the fridge, and what is gonna happen is that salt is gonna draw out some of the moisture, and then it's gonna be reabsorbed back into the meat through osmosis, and that is gonna dry out the surface of the brisket. And again, in my experience, that tends to set me up for building good bark earlier on in the cook process compared to if I just seasoned it and threw it on the smoker. And that is another reason why this isn't too much salt. A lot of this salt is going to be drawn into the meat and it's going to season the meat, probably only a couple of millimeters overnight. But the crux of it is all of this salt isn't going to be on the surface come the morning time. So there is going to be capacity for this brisket to take even more seasoning, which we'll do in the morning. So that might work for you, might not. Definitely works for me, and I'm pretty confident generally in the color of my bark, the look of my bark. So if you haven't done that before, I definitely recommend giving it a go. So we'll get this into the fridge for overnight and we'll come back around 5 o'clock AM. So it is about 5 a.m. You might be able to tell that from my voice. And this brisket has been sat in the fridge overnight. You might be able to see that it is now a little bit drier on the surface. A lot of that salt has disappeared, so you can't visually see it anymore. And that salt has effectively dissolved into the fat and into the meat. So now's a good time to touch up any spots that look like they might need a little bit more black pepper. There is some around the back. And then we're gonna hit the top of this with a seasoned salt. We're gonna go with Lowry's, nothing new, nothing too exciting, but what this is gonna do is give this an extra kick of flavor. We're basically gonna go in and fill in those gaps left by the salt, in between all the little bits of pepper with some Lowry's seasoned salt. And as I say, there are gonna be some steps taken at the end of this cook, which means that even after doing this, it's still not gonna be too salty. Just gonna press that in a little bit, turn it on its side, whatever falls off, falls off. And what we should be left with is a perfectly seasoned brisket. So we're gonna take this outside, get this onto the Franklin pit. Oh good, it's snowing. So the first part of this cook is gonna be all about smoke flavor and setting us up for a great bark color. So we'll be cooking with a nice smoky fire, nice and early on to achieve that. And we'll be cooking around 150 to 180 Fahrenheit. And we'll do that for about 3 hours. So pretty much all we need to do at this point is manage our fire, make sure we've got plenty of smoke rolling. And don't worry, this isn't the kind of dirty smoke that's gonna leave a bad taste. We need way more of it for a much longer time before we have any of those issues. This is just gonna impart a really nice smoke flavor in the end, help us to achieve a really good bark. So we'll just keep cooking in this freezing weather for about 3 hours or so before we come back. So we are 3 hours into this cook and it's been snowing pretty much the entire time. So I've been battling the cold weather, cooking at around 150 up to 180, in some cases 200 Fahrenheit for the first 3 hours, trying to compensate for the cold weather, and I spiked it a little bit, but somewhere between 150 and 200. And all we're trying to do is build some good color, and the brisket's gonna be most susceptible to smoke flavor in this time. So keeping it nice and smoky without overcooking it. And that's pretty much it. No spritzing required at the moment. Nothing's too dry, everything's nice and soft, even this point end. We're gonna shut this down, crank up to about 225 up to 250 for the next couple of hours, probably 3 hours or so. And that's pretty much it. So we are 6 hours on the dot into this cook, and this brisket is looking good. And to be honest, it hasn't been particularly technical up until this point. Notice a little pooling of fat there, juices, so I'm gonna tip that. Must have been where it was scalped a little bit. Everything's feeling good, nothing's feeling too crusty or anything like that, which is the main goal right now. I am gonna go in and just spritz with some water, and I think this is either apple cider vinegar or Worcestershire sauce. I think it's Worcestershire sauce. And I'm just gonna spritz the bits that I think are getting a bit dry. And to be honest, if I can avoid spritzing entirely, then I will. I don't think it adds anything. It's just something to help things from drying out a little bit too much and getting ahead of the rest of the brisket. So just the edges, and I can see that the flat is starting to curl up a little bit. So we're gonna add a little foil wrap to the flat and to the point. So you could just tear up some foil sheets, but I like to use these little foil wraps. These are generally sold as like burger wraps or food service wraps. I use these in my breakfast taco video, and if you get them on offer at a good price, they can be cheaper than buying foil and tearing that up into little sheets. They're nice and thin, they're nice and convenient. We're gonna go in and just wrap that flat, and the same on the point end. And I'm really just trying to protect that point from getting too much direct heat from the fact that it's facing the firebox, and just basically making a little cap for it. And that's pretty much it. We're gonna keep cooking at around 250 minimum, maybe up to 275 at this point, and that's really all there is to it for the moment. I'm not even gonna bother tempering it. No fat is rendered just yet. Bearing in mind that we are 6 hours into this cook, but really only 3 hours into the hot cooking stage. The first couple of hours was really just about smoke flavor. So we'll shut this down, keep cooking 250, 275. And just while we're waiting for that to cook, some of you may have noticed my new chopping block. And this was made by Carvalho Designs, handmade in Oxford, and it is absolutely awesome. Stuart, founder and craftsman, makes these to order, hand makes them to order. As you'll see in this video and videos going forward, this is the perfect barbecue block. Plenty big enough to pretty much trim any brisket you'll come across. It's end grain, so it can really take a beating, and it comes so well prepared that it's super easy to clean. This is the walnut one, but it comes in 3 different woods that you can select, and you can get 10% off using the code. I don't get any kickback from that. That's purely a discount for you. So check the link in the description below and use the code to get a discount and support a small business. So we are 10 hours into this cook, technically 10 hours, but really we've only been cooking for about 7 hours. And I'm gonna take a little temp in the middle of the flat, and this is the point that I take a reading, never in the point where it's gonna be cooking a lot quicker because there's more fat, never in the tip of the flat because it's more on the exterior. So the last place to cook on a brisket is about halfway up the flat and bang in the center. So I'm gonna say this is probably reaching 160-ish, 158. So we are not nearly at the wrap point yet. Regardless of the temp, I wouldn't be wrapping right now anyway. The things that I'm looking for: 3 things. A nice dry surface, so you can see it's quite wet in a lot of places here. That tells me it's still pushing out water moisture. A nice rendered fat cap. This is still quite bouncy in places, so I want to make sure that all of this fat cap is fully rendered before I wrap it. And thirdly, I want to make sure that the internal temperature is at least 170 at a very minimum, and then we'll wrap it up. We've been running a nice steady low flame fire today, and that really is the goal. We don't want to burn anything up, scorch anything up. So I'm pretty confident with how this has been cooking from a fire perspective. Fairly happy with how this is cooking from a visual and an internal temperature perspective. So I think we're on track to have a nice brisket, and I'll show you the method that I've been wrapping with the most frequently recently. Right, so 12 hours into this cook, 9 hours into actively cooking this brisket, and it is looking good. It's still looking quite wet. The fat cap is definitely starting to render. Not quite the kind of renderiness that I want before I wrap it, but we're going to give this a little move around. I'm sorry for the light. So the entire cook time, this point has been toward the fire. It's feeling nice and soft. That is great. That's a really good sign. It means that I haven't scorched anything up. The edges are feeling, they're good. The lean feels a little bit drier than I'd like, but that's just kind of part and parcel of cooking a brisket. In terms of the temperature, on the point, we are looking at around 170 Fahrenheit. In the flat, about 166 Fahrenheit. And in the spot that I'm ultimately going to check this for tenderness, it is feeling very firm at 168. Might be higher in temperature, but what we're looking for is tenderness. So in order to balance everything out a little bit, we are going to flip this round, and we're going to put the flat toward the fire. And the whole point of this is just trying to catch everything up. So naturally the point is going to want to cook quicker than the flat because there's more fat in there. And I'm just trying to balance these two things out. And my judgment call right now is, although we're in the 170s across majority of this brisket, is it time to wrap? And my decision is that no, it's not. We're still a little bit wet on the bark, and I want to make sure that this entire bark is completely dry looking before I do that. In terms of fat render, we're pretty much there. I'm happy with that, but the wetness on the bark tells me that I want to push it a little bit further before I wrap it. So we're going to keep going. Still rocking temperatures of 250, 275-ish. So we'll come back in a little bit, check the temperatures, see if it's time to wrap. 14 hours into this cook, this is ready to wrap. I'm going to call it. It is temping at around 173 in the middle of the flat. Fat's feeling nice and good. Point and the flat are fairly even in terms of temperature. Let's take it inside and wrap it up. That is ready to go. I'm going to wrap this up whilst I talk because I don't want to lose much momentum in this. But as you can probably tell, I'm going to be using the foil boat method. And this is a method that was obviously popularized by the likes of Leroy and Lewis, Bradley Robinson at Chud's Barbecue. And the reason why I've been using this method most recently is for a few reasons. So I really love the outcome that you get in terms of the crispy, crunchy, extra rendered fat cap. I also love the fact that you don't have to try and get a probe through the butcher paper if you wrap it in butcher paper to try and get an understanding of how tender it is. You can just open it up, get underneath, feel whether it's tender or not, and you're good to go. I really like the way that it holds in all of the fat, all of the juices, and generally I feel like you get a less mushy point, or you're less susceptible to getting a mushy point if you do the foil boat method, and you're even more less susceptible to getting a mushy point if you do the unwrap method. But I like to wrap my brisket, so as I say, most recently the foil boat method is what has been working for me, but there are further steps that I do after this. So make sure you stick around to find out what those are. So we're going to put this back onto the pit. We're going to keep it running at around a minimum of 275 Fahrenheit, maybe even as high as 300 if it gets there. But the goal is 275 minimum. Continue to render this fat on top, although it is looking nice and pillowy. Probably doesn't need it that much. And get this thing tender. So we'll put this back onto the pit. 16 hours after this went onto the pit, this brisket is done. And it is looking very good, very dark, nice and barky. Hopefully you can see nice and tender as well. Really nice, squishy, rendered fat cap. exactly what we wanted. So as I say, this brisket is done. How did I know that it was done? It was too dark and too difficult to try and show you that out there, so I'm just gonna show you right now. There were 2 checks that I made to make sure that this was done. The first one is going under the brisket into the very center of the flat and pushing my finger up through. See if I can show you that. Up through the center of the flat, and the fact that I could separate the muscle fibers with my finger was a very good sign. And the other check that I did was a tenderness check with my probe, my instant read thermometer, my chef's temp, and I just went in straight into the middle of the flat, about halfway up, right in the middle of the flat, the last point to get tender on a brisket, and just checked it for tenderness. It feels nice and tender, so I'm confident that this is done. And we could leave it here. You could let this rest until it gets down to an internal temperature of around 145, 150 Fahrenheit, slice right into it, and it is gonna be great. However, 10 out of 10 times, if I'm cooking a brisket, whether it be for a class, for a pop-up, a gathering, anytime I'm cooking briskets, I'm cooking it the day before, and therefore it needs to go into a hot hold overnight to keep warm, and that's exactly what I'm gonna do with this. I personally think, in my opinion, that leads to a more gelatinous, tender, more unctuous brisket, as it gives more time for the collagen to convert to gelatin. And yeah, I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone that's well experienced with briskets that doesn't agree with that. It's definitely not essential. You don't need to do it. If you were to give me 2 briskets side by side, one that had an overnight rest and one that was just rested off the pit, could I tell? I'm not entirely sure. I wouldn't bet my life on it, but my experience tells me that you do get a better brisket. So there are a couple of routes that we could take. We could let this cool down to around 150 and put it into our hot hold at 145, 150, maybe even 140, and come back tomorrow and it'll be ready to go, ready to slice into. We could put this into our hot hold right now and allow a little bit of that carryover to happen to maybe even get it a little bit more tender, potentially risking overcooking it. And those are both things that I've done. However, for me, I like to take an extra step. And again, this isn't necessary, but this is just how I do it. And that's what this video is about, showing you exactly my brisket process for when I'm cooking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 briskets. And I think for me, for my taste, for what I like in a brisket, I think it's worth doing. And that is to take a couple of sheets of foil. And this is gonna be nothing new to people. We're gonna add some beef fat to this, some beef dripping, some beef tallow, depending on where you're from. And if you don't have rendered beef fat on hand, if you're in the UK, you can just go out and just buy some Britannia or any kind of branded beef dripping. It's the same thing, it's rendered beef fat. You could definitely melt it down on the smoker, get some smoke flavor into it. But really, we've got like 3 hours of pretty low temperature, dirty smoke into this brisket, plus another 12 hours of cooking. It doesn't need any more smoke flavor. We're gonna take some rendered beef fat, just go down in the middle. And this whole method really is a bit of a hybrid between the Leroy and Lewis wrap method, the foil boat, and the Goldie's overnight rest method. Might feel unnecessary to you, but for me, works really well. I split the foil on this, so there's not a huge amount of juices in there, but we'll take it. Gonna wrap this up, make sure we get it nice and tight, push down on those edges. And that's pretty much how I get my briskets ready for the long nap overnight. So you're probably thinking to yourself, what is the point of doing the foil boat method to get that crispy rendered fat, just to then wrap it in foil, and not only wrap it in foil, fill it with rendered beef fat that you're probably gonna pour over the top anyway. Kind of feels like it makes the foil boat pointless. But I really like the amount of rendered fat you get with a foil boat, and I really like how the full foil wrap softens up that crispy bark. So you still get a huge amount of rendered fat. It will still have a significantly different texture to a butcher paper wrap brisket, but it will be slightly softer than had we just rested it in its foil boat. So for me, it's kind of the best of both worlds. And again, this is just how I get the best quality brisket, in my opinion. You could just leave this here, come back to it in a couple of hours once it's cooled down. For me, however, I have the luxury of having a warmer, and it's 10:30 at night right now. So I'm gonna go to bed and we'll come back to this tomorrow and we'll see all the benefits of those things tomorrow. So after an overnight rest, this brisket should be ready to cut into. And the test really is to see whether these ends are dried out or charred or crunchy. Everything's feeling nice and soft, and brisket itself is looking nice and jiggly. All of that fat that's in the bottom of that foil can be patted on, makes it look nice and shiny. Let's cut into it and see how we did. That is looking plenty juicy to me. Nice little render on the fat cap there. Could have done a bit of a better job at trimming just there. And the flat side, again, nice and juicy. A lot of fat in there. So I'm gonna flip the flat, make sure nothing oxidizes, and then I'll take some of these burnt ends I think that is a nicely cooked brisket. Nice little fat cap render on top. All of that grain structure hasn't dried out. Nothing's too crispy on this end. Yeah, that's looking really good. I love the yellowing in the fat. That's when you know you've done a good job at rendering it. Let's cut another slice. Yeah, looking really good. And this slice, you know, most people would be happy with that, I would say. Could have done a better job trimming right here. Real nice slice of brisket right there. Yeah, really, really happy with how that turned out. Nice grain structure in there, nothing overcooked. It literally just pulls apart, but isn't mushy or anything like that. As I say, good fat render on there. Give it a little taste. Not too salty at all. I've had saltier brisket at Franklin. By the time you add that additional fat at the end, it really, really isn't too salty at all, even though you'd think it might be. Flat is looking nice and juicy, and I think pull apart tender. Yep, really nice and tender, nice and juicy on the flat. Yeah, really, really nicely cooked brisket. Great smoke flavour from the offset, as you would expect. And as I say, that's pretty much my process at the moment. It changes all the time, but that's kind of what I'm doing. And you might say, you know, you don't need to do this, you don't need to do that. You should do this, you should do that. This process is constantly evolving, so anything I'm doing it for a reason. You could let this rest overnight in a foil boat. You could wrap it up in foil like I did. It's an extra step that I like to do because I feel like it gives me the best possible outcome on a more consistent basis. You don't need to hold it overnight. Again, it's just what I like to do because I feel like it gives me the best results. So I think this video is probably long enough. I hope it gave you some tips and some tricks on how to cook brisket better, perhaps. If you like the video, like, comment, subscribe, do all those things. It really, really does help me out. I'm gonna make some breakfast tacos out of this, and I'll see you next week for another video.